Welcome back to VMware View Administration Training. This time around, we're going to talk about the Kiosk Mode feature within VMware View. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start by talking about what Kiosk Mode is, and then we'll talk about some of the use cases in which Kiosk Mode can be advantageous to us. I'll cover the steps that you need to complete in order to set up Kiosk Mode, and then we'll talk about what we need to do on the client side. We'll finish up the lecture with some best practices of setting up Kiosk Mode, and then jump into a demonstration where I'll set up our lab environment for Kiosk Mode and show you what it looks like from the client's perspective. So let's start by talking about what Kiosk Mode is. Kiosk Mode is the ability to automatically log in a client device and connect to a desktop, all without having to have an end user log in. To do this, View has a flexible authentication feature that's used to authenticate the device rather than an individual user. We do this by creating a user account specifically for that client device, which the View client will be able to use in order to log in to that desktop. That user account is actually going to be based on the MAC address for that client device, which of course should be unique within the environment. Alternatively, you can manually create user accounts for each client device, but they must start with the word custom and a hyphen. Since there's no user actually logging into the desktop, we need to depend on our applications to authenticate individual users if necessary. A good example of where Kiosk Mode wouldn't be a great idea is if we need to provide the users access to the Outlook client. Outlook, of course, automatically logs into Exchange using our Active Directory credentials that we logged into the desktop with. Since we're not using our own credentials to log into the View desktop, Outlook will not be able to connect properly. To get around this, we can use Outlook Web Access, which will prompt the end user for a username and password at the time they launch the application. So two people can access the same device, but still be able to get to their individual email accounts. And all the features that you would have on that particular client will be fully supported with Kiosk Mode. So items like USB redirection and PC over IP are fully supported when a Windows client device is connecting via Kiosk Mode. So in what cases is Kiosk Mode useful to us? Think of a nursing work area, where nurses are coming and going constantly, but needing to access computers in a private place. You could set up several different client devices and configure them to use Kiosk Mode. This is useful in this scenario because it allows the nurses to not have to have an extra login in order to access Active Directory. You can then rely on the one or two applications that nurses truly need access to authenticate them using the application's authentication database. Many medical apps don't actually use Active Directory for authentication. They have their own database for authentication. Airline check-in kiosks are also a great case for Kiosk Mode. The device automatically connects to a web page that's really just a form process for the end user to go through. Each user has a unique reservation that they can search for using a confirmation number or credit card number. This would be equivalent to authenticating to the application. When that user is done and they exit out of the process, it goes back to a normalized state where the next user can then log in. Customer information stations can be really useful in a retail setting like we have in our scenario. When looking at a piece of furniture, the user can go to a customer information station and not have to log in at all in order to access a catalog that can tell them the options they would have for fabrics and colors. Of course, we can't assign each customer that comes into the store their own login within Active Directory, so without Kiosk Mode, they'd have no ability to access this application. And finally, there can be a lot of different uses for an information sign. In our own scenario, having a big screen TV mounted up in the IT area could be useful for showing what our current call volume is for help desk tickets, or what current status is for network devices. Since there's no need to have an individual user log into this client or the desktop, we can easily have the client device authenticate to View, receive a desktop, and automatically launch a web page that'll display this information. Other uses of an information sign could be the arrival and departure information in an airport, or an automatically updated scrolling ticker in a stockbroker's office. So, what does it take to set up Kiosk Mode? First, you want to make sure to have a parent image for the pool to be based upon. In this image, you want to make sure to have the bare minimum number of applications that the kiosk will need to use. You'll generally want to lock down this image as well, so the users can't break out of the environment that you want to provide them and be able to access something else within your Active Directory environment. Oftentimes, these kiosks are in a public location that could provide a serious security risk. Next, create a pool and entitle the group to access this particular pool. This group is a group that we'll want to create ahead of time within Active Directory. In the next step, we'll tell View to add each user account we create for the clients into this group. Once the client accounts are added to this group, they'll automatically be entitled to use this desktop pool. So the first command we need to run can be on any of the View connection servers within a group of connection servers. Remember, all the connection servers are sharing one LDAP database that they replicate to one another at a high speed. So once we complete this command on one View connection server, it'll quickly be deployed to the other ones. In order to set up kiosk mode, we'll take advantage of the vdm admin command, which is our main command line interface to the View connection server. We'll start with the flag of Q, which tells vdm admin that we're going to be configuring client access for kiosk mode. We'll then use the client auth flag to let vdm admin know that we want to set up the client authentication specifically. We'll then use the set defaults command to let it know we're going to set the defaults for all the client accounts that we create. The OU flag identifies where the user accounts will be placed into within our OU structure of Active Directory. Next, we'll use a no expire password flag, which identifies that the user account will not have an expiring password. And finally, we identify which group we want these accounts to be added into. Next, we need to go over to the client device and display the MAC address for that client, because that's what the username is going to be based on for the client device. The next step then, back on the connection server, is to create the AD account for the client device. So again, we'll use the Q and client auth flags. We'll then give it an add flag, and then define the domain using the domain flag. And finally, we'll use the client ID flag to identify the MAC address. This will create a user account that contains the MAC address, and based on our defaults, we'll place them in the proper OU and group. We'll then need to identify which connection servers have the ability to authenticate client-based connections. We simply provide the Q command, the enable flag to enable kiosk mode, and then the -s command to identify the connection server that we want to be able to use kiosk mode with. We would run this command multiple times for however many connection servers we want to be able to authenticate client devices. This is one example of where we may want to use tags to limit certain pools to certain connection servers if we didn't want client devices to be authenticated on any connection server. There is a require password flag that can be used at this step, but it's important to note that when using this require password flag, any clients that were created with automatically generated passwords will no longer be able to access their pool through this connection server. And then finally, we'll verify our setup by using the vdm admin command with the Q and client auth flags, and then providing just the list flag. Now back on the client side, it's usually best to run the client from a command line or batch script so they can automatically be kicked off, usually through the startup commands. VMware does provide an example script in the installation directory of the View client under the bin directory called kiosk mode cmd. An example of this command uses the wswc executable, which is our View client, and gives it the flag of unattended. If you haven't set a default value for the server connection on the client device, you'll need to provide the server URL flag to identify the connection server that this client will connect to. By default, this command will use the MAC address-based username. By providing unattended, that tells the View client to go through the same algorithm that the vdm admin command would have used to generate that particular username. You can also provide a username and password flag that can be used when we want to manually create our user accounts and use the custom - naming convention. Now before we get into actually showing those commands in the real world, let's talk a few best practices. First, in a large environment, you would want to dedicate connection servers to authenticate kiosk mode clients. This way you can use tags to lock down which connection servers have access to our kiosk pools. and also eliminate regular users from accessing those connection servers. We want to place our client user accounts in dedicated OUs and groups. Most of the time, we'll want these user accounts in their own OUs so we can apply specific group policies that will only apply to the kiosk mode desktops. And the groups are used for entitling client devices to the proper pools. Within your virtual desktop, you'll probably want to configure it to not have a lockout after a certain amount of inactivity. Think of something like an airline check-in kiosk, where it may only be accessed once every hour or two. If that desktop automatically locked after half an hour of non-use, you potentially may have to deal with disconnecting the session and reconnecting to a new one before the customer can access that device. And finally, make sure not to entitle a client machine to more than one pool. Kiosks are usually created for specific purposes and shouldn't have this need, but if you do provide access to a client to more than one pool, this will cause confusion because View won't know which pool to connect that client device to. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into a demonstration of how kiosk mode is configured and connected to by the end users. We're going to start by looking at our parent VM and the changes we made in order to enable this. Here you can see in our all users startup directory, I've created a batch file. Let's take a look at this batch file, and you'll see that on startup, Windows is going to automatically launch Internet Explorer in its kiosk mode and connecting to the trainsignal.com website. Now, this website could be anything. For IT administrative staff, for their information screen, this could be an internal website that monitors the status of tickets and systems. In the retail locations, this website could connect to the internal site that the customers will be able to use. So with this script in the startup menu for all users, any user who logs into this desktop will automatically be sent to that web page in full kiosk mode. Let me show you what that looks like by launching this batch file real quick. Now, the resolution is low in this particular virtual machine console, so that's why we see the scroll bars. But other than the scroll bars, all you see is the Train Signal website. Switching over to our View Administrator console, let's take a look at the kiosk pool that I've pre-created for this lesson. Here you can see it's called Retail Kiosk, with the display name of Retail Customer Kiosk. This pool will represent the desktops that the kiosks in the retail location will connect to. It is a floating automated pool, set to have a minimum of 4, with 4 always powered on, and a maximum of 8 desktops. The reasoning behind this is that we have 4 kiosk stations in the retail store. This provides enough desktops that all 4 of them can be disconnected and immediately try to reconnect and still have a desktop available to them. Our parent VM is the View XP Parent 01, which is the same parent we've used in our other pools. The difference here is that the image we're using is a whole different snapshot I've taken, with changes made specifically to be a kiosk, namely that batch file that we just looked at in the startup folder. I've also identified a different OU to put these desktops in, because I wanted to have a specific set of policies applied to them, to manage them since they will be kiosk-type stations. They'll be running a single application and not a full version of Windows. Now, let's start to configure our View connection servers to enable kiosk mode. To do that, we need to use the VDM admin command. So the first step is to set the default client values. The command that I'm going to enter here is exactly the one that we looked at in the slides just a little bit ago. So we've now set the default settings for the client authentication piece for our kiosks. Our next step is to create the client accounts, but first we need to go and get the MAC addresses for our clients. So on our client that's going to act as the kiosk, on a command prompt we need to get to the C program files, VMware, VMware View, client bin directory. Inside of there, our view client is represented by the WSWC executable. To get the MAC address, though, we need to give it the flag of print environment info. Once we have this MAC address written down, we can switch back to our view connection server. Now we can run the command to create the Active Directory account for our client machine. Again, this command is going to be directly out of the slides earlier in this lesson. Switching over to our domain controller and looking in our Active Directory users and computers, we can see that based on our default setting in the View Kiosks Clients OU, we can see that there is a new user account that was created and is based on the MAC address of our client machine. This is the account that the client will use to authenticate to View, and now View is configured to accept this client account. Now that we've switched back to our connection server, let's enable client-based authentication. So our connection server is now enabled to use client authentication. Now we can verify our configuration. So here we see that our client ID has been added, and we can see the list of our connection servers that have been enabled for client authentication, which includes our View Con01 server. Now switching back to our View Administrator console, we have one final task to complete, and that is to entitle our users. So let's click the Entitlements button, and we'll click Add, and we'll search for a group that starts with View Kiosk. We'll find the View Kiosk Clients group. This group was manually created, but is automatically populated when we created the View Client user account, because the default was set to use this group and add any clients to it. So we'll go ahead and click OK, and click OK again. Now we've entitled our clients to use this pool. So let's switch over to one of those clients and take a look at what it looks like. Normally, we would configure this client to automatically log in with a user account. But in this case, I haven't configured that yet so that we can take a look at how it works. First of all, in the startup folder, I've added a View Kiosk AutoConnect.command so that when a user logs into this machine, this command will be executed. So let's take a look at that. So in this command, I call the wswc.exe, which is the file name for the View client. I then give it an unattended switch, which tells it to log in automatically using the kiosk mode default user. I also provide it the server URL flag, along with the name of our View connection server. You can also place a specific username and password in here that you can define without having to go through the process of creating an account for each client. Now let's go ahead and execute the script. And now our View session is completely loaded, and you can see that the Internet Explorer window is automatically launched in this virtual desktop and set up for full screen kiosk mode, so the user only sees the web page that we want to provide them access to. Again, this could be an internal application that's web delivered for the users to do whatever it is that they need to do. So that's how you would set up kiosk mode. When it comes to setting up kiosk mode, Everything you need to know should be in the View Administration Guide, so I would highly recommend using that as a resource while setting this up. So let's wrap up. We started talking about what Kiosk Mode is, and how it'll look within your View environment. Then I covered a few of the use cases in which Kiosk Mode makes a lot of sense, and could bring a lot of value to your business. Then we covered the steps that it takes to set up Kiosk Mode, including the commands that need to be run on both your connection server and on your client device. I then gave you a few best practices when setting up Kiosk Mode. And finally, I did a quick demonstration of how to set up Kiosk Mode and what it looks like from a client perspective. So that's all I've got for Kiosk Mode. I hope to see you in the next lesson.